We're delighted to have you join us. And just to do a quick check to see if you're in the right place, let me start with a few, maybe a little bit provocative questions, like would you like your leaders to increase employee engagement by up to 8 times, double or triple their motivation to implement a personal development plan, build coaching and leadership skills around natural strengths, make performance appraisals an inspiring event that everyone can look forward to, and double their rate of improvement from 360 feedback? Let me see the hands. How many would like to do that? Now, it sounds a little far-fetched, and I know these claims sound like they're really out there, but actually, what we're going to be looking at over the next 55 minutes or so is some very solid research that can do all those things that are claimed there. Now, this session is designed to be primarily for people who are in roles, like you see listed, that are concerned about developing leaders in their organizations. And so, or could be that some of you are also here for your own personal development, but I'll be primarily looking at how we can help to build leadership and leadership skills across an organization or with a group of people. So looking at where we're drawing this material from, there is the original book that a lot of the work for Zenger-Folkman was drawn from was called The Extraordinary Leader, and you'll see a little later on a program by that name that continues building on that research base. And then today we're going to draw fairly heavily from The Extraordinary Coach, which was published about 6 or 8 years ago now. And the work of The Extraordinary Leader especially, but of strengths-based leadership, which is what we're going to be looking at as well today, is in a more recent book published a couple of years ago called How to Be Exceptional. So there's the sort of depth or the material we're drawing from. Today we're really going to skip across the icebergs. We're just going to be touching the tips of a couple of key areas. I wish in 1 hour or 55 minutes I could give it all to you, and there it is, it's done. But obviously these are large areas, and so we're going to be drawing from the Extraordinary Leader Workshop. These are the main topic areas, and so you'll see those woven into our agenda, that these 8 topic areas are primarily what's in that session. And so I'll draw from a lot of that work. And then we also are be drawing even more heavily from the Extraordinary Coach Workshops, which has a number of configurations. The main one, the core program that we're going to draw most from today, is a 4-step fuel process and a whole philosophy approach to coaching, that the 6 steps of extraordinary coaching we're going to be drawing from. I will touch briefly on elevating feedback, which is a recently revised and updated workshop, and typically half a day. And then we'll be looking at developing yourself as a coach, which is anywhere from 2/3 of a day to a day session that uses 360 feedback and strength-based approaches, as does the Extraordinary Leader. So it's the same kind of process. So these are the different sorts of configurations and modules, or we do have them all put together in a 2-day workshop as well. So this is where we're drawing from, and towards the end of this session I'll explain a bit more of some of these options. So our overall agenda then is to look at those 6 steps that deal with extraordinary coaching, to take a very brief overview of what we're learning about elevating feedback, to get us more into building coaching and leadership strengths, and the research showing just how more effective that is. And we'll talk about a strength-based 360, and I'm guessing many of you are familiar with and have used 360s. This is quite an unusual one and a real pioneering kind of approach. And as well, a pioneering approach is cross-training, where we're looking at how we build strengths from good to great. We'll talk briefly about that and then finish up with what are some potential next steps. So there we go. There's a quick skip across the icebergs that we're going to be taking. And certainly Brad and I are very happy to talk further with you about any of this and get down deeper below the surface into the real the meat of any of these topic areas. So let's begin. Let's start with looking at the 6 steps to developing extraordinary coaching skills. Starting first of all, we find with really getting clear about what exactly is coaching and what isn't coaching. Coaching is one of these terms that's used very broadly and has come to mean all kinds of things. We actually ran into a client a couple of years ago where to say to somebody, I'd like to give you a little coaching, sent shivers up their spine because it was basically, I'm going to reprimand you, I'm going to correct you, I'm going to tell you about problems and fix your weaknesses, and that was called coaching. So it is a broad array of different definitions of what coaching is. Fairly recently, I was writing a blog on some of this, and I came back across, from one of my earlier books, a definition of coaching that is going back a few years now. Tom Peters, after his book In Search of Excellence, worked with Nancy Austin to produce what I think was a great book called A Passion for Excellence. And here's a part of the definition they offered for coaching, which I think is very relevant to our discussion today, that it's enabling others to act and building on their strengths, facilitating, making easy, pulling people together, face-to-face pulling people together, getting the coachee to step up to their responsibility, to continue their achievement, and to see them as full-scale partners and contributors. That definition aligns extremely well with what you're going to be seeing over the next little bit. And in fact, one of the things that we do early on in our coaching process is, in any one of those programs that I just talked about, is distinguish between training, and so we see here a bit of the definition we have for training, for imparting skills and knowledge and information. It's a teacher-student kind of relationship that is typically in a classroom or maybe on the job, but it's a fairly temporary kind of situation like that. Or mentoring. Now, coaching and mentoring get used a lot together, and mentoring, of course, can be very powerful and is used in lots of places in organizations today. And it's oftentimes where a more senior, more experienced person, somebody who's been down that road, is providing help, wisdom, insights, maybe connections, references, and just really helping others benefit from their experience. Well, we're going to be talking about coaching today like this, similar to that definition we just looked at from A Passion for Excellence, where it could be anybody. It doesn't have to be that the coach has more experience or is somehow a higher level of wisdom or insight than the coachee, and that it is, they don't have to come from the same background. So a word that I really would put in here would be facilitate, that a good coach is somebody that facilitates conversations and facilitates discussions. And so our definition of coaching then is to say that it is where we're having interactions, typically two-way kinds of interactions, that are expanding awareness. And by this we mean awareness of both the coach and the coachee, trying to figure out how we can arrive at superior solutions and make and implement better decisions. Now, that's a fairly simple sentence, but it actually has quite a lot packed in there. And as we go through the next number of steps, you'll start to see just the depth of the iceberg that's down below each one of those short phrases or even words. Primarily, we look at coaching in two broad applications. First of all, one that's probably the most common, I will often ask people in sessions, how many of you are most interested in this one? And about 70% of the hands go up, which is where we're working primarily with a direct report or someone who we have some responsibility or wanting in some way to increase their overall performance. Another type of coaching that's also becoming stronger and more popular is career coaching, which may or may not be a direct reporting relationship. Even in performance coaching, it's not always that it's a direct report. It could be somebody that's in a support role, like in HR or OD or some kind of internal support role. In either case, primarily that's more in the case of career coaching. So that's very simply and quickly our overview of coaching, or our definition of coaching. So let's then move into what do we do with that, and how do we get people really on side, hopefully fostering even greater energy and enthusiasm for coaching. Coaching, of course, is a popular topic. One of the reasons why, as Brad said, we have over 600 people registered for this webinar, because we know it's a very popular topic. And one of the reasons is because it has a big impact, but oftentimes we're asking people to kind of take that on faith. So what I'd like to show you is the results of research that Zenger-Folkman, and this is one of the reasons why the Clemmer Group has partnered with Zenger-Folkman, which we just did about 2 years ago, is because of the depth of the research that they bring to these general sort of topic areas. And so here is the original research base for a lot of the material that you're going to be seeing, and certainly for the next series of slides you're going to see, the data slides. So this is 250,000 people rated roughly 25,000 leaders and coaches. So it's typically about 10 raters per leader. And what this data is sliced in a couple different ways. Here's one example, which is asking how many people are thinking about quitting. And our research shows that people who indicate they're thinking about quitting, often within 18 months, about 50% of them do quit. So this is showing the correlation across, on the left-hand side, the number of people that are thinking about quitting. So we see over 50% of people that are thinking about quitting rate the coaching effectiveness using the 360 tool. The coaching effectiveness is rated by every rater for that coach, not just the employee that's thinking about quitting, but everybody who's rating that person at the very lowest percentile, the 1 to 9th percentile. And so on down. You can see as we move across that those who are rated as the very best coaches at the 80th and 90th percentiles are the ones that have the far fewest people who are actually thinking about quitting. And so we see an iceberg in the background. Well, I've already used an iceberg here as one analogy for today's session, but the reason I bring it in here is because these are people that quit and leave, which is really the tip of the iceberg. The much bigger part of the iceberg are the people that quit and stay. And of course, that's where we start to get into this all-important and very concerning area for many people these days of how do we increase employee commitment. And so here we see employee commitment measured, again through surveys and feedback data, with the very lowest level of commitment coming at those leaders and coaches who are really rated poorly. They're the least effective coaches. And so we see very low commitment level. Now we see it increasing as we go across up into the 30th percentile. Even as we go across even further up to the 70th percentile, we see quite an increase. But look at these last two jumps. Outstanding coaches, or we call an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary coach, someone at the 90th percentile. That's our definition of extraordinary. And we can see the incredible difference. And so one of the earlier slides I showed at the beginning was, would you like to have 8 times higher commitment or employee engagement? Well, that's where some of the data comes from to ask that kind of question. Well, we see similar patterns then. We see the impact on extra effort. So these are people that on a 5-point scale rated a 5, saying around here employees are willing to go the extra mile. So we're just skimming off those who rated that as a 5 to say, yes, that's very true. And again, what we see here is those who have very poor coaches, where the workplace is rated by everybody in the workplace as being a poor coach leading that team or that workplace. Very low number of people that are willing to go the extra mile, that are put out an effort of 5. And then we see it going up higher in the middle. And again, we don't see huge differences across the center here. We see some incremental improvements. But once again, take a look at what happens with extraordinary coaches. We see huge impact on what's often been called volunteerism or extra effort, discretionary effort, where I'm willing to give it a 5 because I'm working for an outstanding coach who does a great job of coaching and developing me and my team. Well, as you would expect then, the impact on leader satisfaction. So overall, do I feel like my supervisor is doing a good job, whether that's a VP or whether that's a first-line supervisor, but the person I report to, do I feel that they're doing a good job? And once again, we see this same pattern where those who are working, this one's a little more step-up incremental, but it is showing, again, the overall pattern that those who are rating their supervisors highest are the ones that are getting the best coaching and feedback about their performance. Well, lastly, we'll take a look at the how people feel valued. And similar to the last slide, we see again this pattern where I'm going to feel much more valued when I'm getting coaching and feedback. And of course, as Don Cherry or Yogi Berra might say, it's not rocket surgery. This really does make sense. And yet when we start to see just the differences in real hard numbers, begin to appreciate the incredible impact of coaching. So in the Extraordinary Coach materials and in our program, we spend a bit of time early on really making sure that we get a sense of just what kind of an impact does coaching have generally, and then even more specifically, what impact would it have, could it have, should it have for me in my coaching? Well, let's go on then to step 3. So now we say, well, it's important, but what is it? We've defined it, but what are the key elements of it? And so the FUEL model, F-U-E-L, is what we're going to be seeing here momentarily, is the key part of this coaching conversation. Let's start, first of all, with talking a bit about the traps that we use this model to overcome. So oftentimes, coaches, leaders, just jump in, spur of the moment, on the fly, and don't really give a lot of thought. And it doesn't have to be huge preparation, but even just taking a few minutes to think about how am I going to approach this and what am I going to say. Here's another major trap that many, many coaches fall into, is not really clarifying what is it that the coachee wants, because we want to ultimately have this conversation being heavily owned by and negotiated or navigated by the coachee, so that the coach is there more as facilitating the conversation. So that means that the coach's airtime, we have a little acronym that we often use, WAIT, W-A-I-T, which stands for why am I talking? Why am I talking? What's the purpose of me talking right now? And if it's because I'm offering advice way too early, or I'm not looking at alternatives, or perhaps I'm not really getting good commitment to change, or maybe we're not really following through and getting good accountability. So if my talking isn't facilitating or moving those things forward, then it's probably detracting, not adding to the conversation. So 75-25 is the sort of ratio that we have. 75% the coachee is talking, 25% the coach is talking. Well, let's talk a bit about structure. And the FUEL model is a structure. With structure, what we find in our research shows there's a lot more consistency in coaching, the conversation is more efficient, and the overall quality of the coaching interaction improves. But many managers don't have much structure. Many don't jump in with a lot of planning, and so end up thinking that they're coaching. The employee just sees it as checking up on things or kind of dealing with an operational issue. They really don't consider it coaching. The overall confidence on both parts typically will slide down without some sort of structure, and it's easy for managers to revert back to the old patterns again, especially when things aren't going perhaps the way they really want them to. So what is the FUEL model? Well, it's a 4-step process that starts with framing the conversation, gets into understanding the current state, looks at how we explore desired states, and laying out a success plan. Now, talk about a tip of an iceberg. Now, this is where there's a tremendous amount of depth behind this. And here's just a quick example. So each one of those steps, we have a number of sub-steps. We have a couple of other key questions that you might ask. And certainly as we get into steps 3 and 4, we start to probe down even deeper. But this is an area where we clearly need to get down deeper into how we frame these conversations. Well, a lot of this work comes through science that have been developed from, first of all, the Zenger-Folkman research, which have identified 14 competencies of coaching. Now, in our follow-up email, we'll send you a connection to a paper called Bringing Science to the Art of Coaching, and you can look deeper at these. But it's around relationships. These are competencies on relationships, around communication. There are 5 of them. Around action and results, because what good is coaching if it doesn't take us to some kind of result or action? And ultimately, to carry on, to keep this rolling along with ongoing support. So that's part of where this has come from. The other part of where this work and the research grounding of this work is to look at other disciplines where coaching is the reason that they exist. So things like counseling, social work, psychotherapy, clinical psychology. Obviously, these are different than what we're doing in workplaces with coaching, but there's a lot to be learned from their approaches. So it's pulling from Zenger-Folkman's research, from work like some of the more recent brain and research and stages of change work, and especially from something like motivational interviewing, which has become quite a standard in those helping professions. And so motivation in the interviewing, some of the key points there are that it's about collaboration, that the helper, that is the coach, the counselor, whoever it is not trying to mentor the individual, not trying to give them wisdom or experience, but is trying to facilitate the conversation so that the coachee is owning and driving and having the autonomy of that conversation. So what is that? What's the bottom line of that? Well, it means that we need to focus oftentimes on topics of importance and matter to the coachee. Now, again, not always. There's times certainly when we're getting into performance issues where the coach might be raising the topic and bringing it forward. But how did this go from the coachee's point of view? Because what that does is, in the counseling professions, it has dramatically reduced attrition, that is people coming back again to continue their counseling, and it has improved overall effectiveness by over 65%. Well, let's continue on skipping over these icebergs, because these are some pretty deep areas, but let's just keep going through to our last 2 steps. So here we're looking at how do we build coaching effectiveness through skill development. Well, again, there are lots of deep areas here to cover, but here's sort of the overall goal. What we're trying to achieve with coaching skill building is to move away from this typical scenario where the employee complains or raises an issue or, hey, boss, got a problem with the monkey on the back. Got this little monkey you need to take care of, hey, boss. So the boss takes the monkey and says, all right, I'll take care of that, or gives advice, does mentoring or training, and then expects the employee to make it happen. And, of course, typically 3, 4, 5, 6 months, weeks, months later, it hasn't happened to the degree the manager is happy with, and then they'll follow up and the frustration can continue from there. And so what we want to move towards is this kind of cycle, where the manager, through good questioning, through using a kind of framework like I've just described, through building partnering approach with the employee and guiding the conversation, ends up having the employee doing more of their own examination of the problem, expanding their own awareness, getting into potential solutions that he or she can really see and own and want to move forward and really take on a high degree of commitment to making this happen. So that takes skills, in our experience, to do that. And some of the unique challenges in skill building that we have found is that a lot of times for coaches coming into the programs, it really requires unlearning old habits, unlearning old mindsets, old beliefs about what coaching is. And it's useful sometimes to get down deeper into where does that come from. And there's a lot of coloring of coaching that comes out of the world of sports and athletics. And of course, there we have coaches do give direction from the sideline, and some elements like the coach isn't on the field playing, doing the actual playing, some of that certainly applies. But others can be very misleading because what many athletic coaches are doing is really mentoring and training, where they're giving the benefit of their advice, they're directing, they're giving feedback, and they're helping to build the skills of the athlete through training or mentoring. Very legitimate, obviously makes lots of sense in the world of athletics, but that's not the kind of coaching that we're talking about here in this process and this approach. And when coaches aren't coaching effectively, I think Marshall Goldsmith really nailed it right on the money when he said that a leader who's a really good coach can dramatically enhance the organization's success. We just saw evidence of that a few minutes ago. But he also goes on to say somebody who kind of dabbles at coaching and calls what they're doing coaching, for example, giving somebody corrective feedback or reprimands and calling it coaching, might actually be doing some serious harm. So we need to make sure that we're building good skills to do this. And so that means, as the last step here then, that we are strengthening strong collaboration, building that sense of we both own this together. And so that we get away from, this is a lot of typical what gets in my way of coaching. These are a lot of times of what we hear. What we find the real reasons are coaches aren't comfortable with a lot of, we call them courageous conversations, difficult conversations. One of my previous books was called Moose on the Table, which is very much getting into this issue. They maybe feel insecure about the true value of their coaching and whether it's really making any kind of difference or not. And maybe they don't really understand what good coaching is, which is what we've talked about way back at the beginning. And oftentimes managers will say, well, my direct reports aren't really asking for it, therefore I'm not sure how valuable or needed it is. So to start to wrap up then, we want to empower and encourage coaches to seek coaching because it increases a lot more when that happens. And when it's a two-way street, then we see that it can create a very different dynamic. And we can more broadly make coaching available to everybody. We can build it into high potential programs, and we can link the coaches receiving training with those that really want the training. All right. Well, that's a quick look at the 6 steps of coaching. Now I want to get into a little bit on elevating feedback, and then we'll start to talk about how do we build skills with strengths-based approaches. So elevating feedback, what I just took you through in the 6 steps was really primarily what the one-day Extraordinary Coach program is around. I'm going to show you now the half-day elevating feedback. We're going to draw a lot from that material. And so we start, first of all, again with definitions. In this case, we're using the term reinforcing feedback and motivational feedback, or reinforcing feedback, which is motivational and is really recognizing the kinds of behaviors that we want to see continue. The other way that we use feedback here is redirecting feedback, where perhaps the coach needs to step in and be a little more directive in their approach to usually a performance issue. So that includes perhaps things, suggestions for doing something that hasn't been done, maybe ideas about improving the way something is done, and potentially recommendations to discontinue some behavior or something that's getting in the way. So what's the process? Well, typically what we do is we talk about why is it that many coaches find it difficult to give both reinforcing and redirecting feedback, because oftentimes it does get fairly personal, and it might even be that emotions can get in the way, or that the relationship between the giver and the receiver might be jeopardized in some way. And of course, we don't always agree with what we hear, so there might be just differences of opinion and differences of perception. And so what makes giving feedback, so the first is around receiving feedback, how we often feel in receiving it. Then we look at what makes giving it so hard. Well, of course, it's very difficult many times to predict, and maybe we allow fear to get in the way, and we start to really get worried about where other people are coming from, and concerned that perhaps we're going to have some negative consequences, and that especially in feedback that we're trying to redirect might be misconstrued, but even reinforcing feedback can be misconstrued as well. So the kind of approach that we use is to have a discussion like we just did about what gets in the way. We look at as well some research on emotions and psychological needs that are on both sides of that equation. The needs we have for reinforcing feedback, recognition, support, celebration, etc., and the needs that we have to be told when we're off track or something's not quite right. And we all appreciate if being told if I'm walking around with a piece of broccoli in my tooth after lunch, I sure appreciate if somebody lets me know rather than I get home and look in the mirror and it's still there. So we have these needs for feedback on either side of the equation. And so we get into then talking about how to provide reinforcing feedback using some video examples, debriefing, practicing with a partner, and primarily with a lot of this work, it's let's get down to the so what. So what do we do with this? Here's an example of a coaching development plan. One of the steps, this is step 3 here, where this person has identified Alex, who they want to give some reinforcing feedback to. And so you see some of the key messages that they want to try to deliver. So then getting into what's often a lengthier part of this workshop, because it's typically a little more difficult, is redirecting feedback. And so there's some exercises that we go through that looks at how would you like to receive redirecting feedback from your boss if you were off track and maybe weren't aware of it. And then we use the fuel model to get into a discussion around providing that redirecting feedback and look at some video examples of that. And once again, take real situations. We're not big lovers or believers in role play. We really believe that this kind of work requires looking at real situations that we're dealing with and figuring out how it is that we can use these skills in those real situations, and then take them back and build them into our coaching development plan. And so in this case, what we see is the fuel model that's often used in reinforcing feedback, just in a different way. So we're just applying different sorts of questions and a different sort of model or approach to that model. So when we're providing that feedback, we want to make sure that we're having those tough, courageous conversations, because they are ones that a lot of leaders tend to avoid. We often discuss that in the workshop. Use the fuel model, because it has been well proven, and really be on the lookout for emotions, and especially in redirecting feedback, we might have to hit the pause button. We might need to come back at another point if things either on our part as the coach or on the part of the coachee are just getting a little too emotional. Well, a couple of last comments here before we wrap up and move on to strength-based is we often hear talk about feedback sandwiches. This is an unlearning for many people. The idea that, well, the way I should give feedback is I should say something positive, reinforcing, then give the redirecting message that I want to give, and then finish on a positive note. That's often called a feedback sandwich. And our experience is that is not effective. And it is some unlearning that a number of coaches need to do, because it can diminish the impact of either message. And some people are waiting for the other shoe to drop and waiting for that piece in the middle. Others don't hear the piece in the middle and only hear the positive part and didn't get the message that it was that you're trying to follow through or trying to bring across. So just a quick point on redirecting feedback, which is something that we talk a little more about in the session. So we end up then, once again, back to so what. So what do we do with this? Here's an example of Tammy being, this is the coach is going to have a conversation with Tammy, and these are some of the key messages that the coach wants to bring across to her. All right, well, I know that was quick, and again, it was just a bit of an overview and a chance for perhaps you, if you're here for more your personal learning, to think about what's the checklist of how you're dealing with feedback. Are there some areas here for further development? And if you're developing others, are we bringing in some of the right kind of skill building and the right kind of approaches for how we build coaching feedback skills in our leaders or in coaches? So let's go on then to the very foundation piece, and what attracted me most when I reconnected with Jack Zenger a few years back, and the Clemmer Group became the Canadian partner for Zenger Folkman. This was an area I had been deep into the work of Martin Seligman at University of Pennsylvania and the whole positive psychology movement, the work around strength-based leadership that has been coming out of a number of places. I've been deep into that, and when I saw the kind of methodology and approaches, because I'd been in touch with it philosophically, but never really saw any practical tools or applications. And Zenger Folkman is had spent at that point about 10, 12 years developing and researching and building tools that now that I've been using them for a few years, I find to be incredibly powerful and very different than a lot of what we're used to. Because typically, what we're used to when it comes to performance improvement, we have a performance appraisal discussion, and we're going to talk about how do you improve performance. Well, in a typical 1-hour conversation, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, we talk about good things and positives and strengths, and then we get into, now let's talk about your improvement areas, which is let's fix your weaknesses. And we spend the good bulk of the rest of the conversation talking about fixing weaknesses. Or we do training needs analysis, and we look at what are the training needs of our leaders and our teams, and often it's, these are the weaknesses. We've got to fix this stuff. And so our approach, and we're going to see some of the research here, is to say that fixing weaknesses is causing all kinds of problems and is not as effective as building strengths by a long shot. We're going to look at some of that. But before we do, let's go back to, of course, the great sage, Peter Drucker, often thought of as the father of modern management. He put his finger on this back in the 60s. He wrote a book called The Effective Executive, and it's a fairly short little read. It's as relevant today as ever. It's about a 150-page book. An entire chapter was dedicated, first time we've ever seen in any management literature, this kind of focus on building strengths. And here's what he said, some of what he said. Here's a quote from that chapter, that we can't really build performance on weaknesses. We can only build on strengths. He calls that foolish and irresponsible to focus on weaknesses, even a misuse of human resources, because all a weakness really is a limitation. And how do you build on limitations? And even we would argue, how do you strengthen limitations? Well, it's challenging to do. Not that it can't be done, but it's very challenging to do. Well, one of the classic stories that comes out of positive psychology movement, which has grown very rapidly over the last couple of years, is this how it's being used in the classroom. And here we have an example, a story of a grade 7 teacher that gave an assignment to each kid to have them put their name at the top of a piece of paper and then to pass that around the room. And when you get that paper with that student's name on it, write down what you think their greatest strength is. So at the end of the exercise, I get back my paper with all my strengths written out by my classmates. So Ryan was one of the classmates here, went through this, and she did a number of other things in the positive psychology movement, such as gratitude lists and 3 best things exercises, and there's a number of other things. But in this case, Ryan, if we flash forward now 10 years or so, Ryan went off and joined the U.S. Marines and went overseas, actually went to Iraq, and the sad, tragic part of this is that he was killed in action in Iraq, and his body was brought back to his hometown. And at the funeral, the teacher was there, and a number of Ryan's old classmates came up to her after the service and started talking to her about what a neat experience it was in grade 7 and how that whole impact really stayed with him. And one of them said, and you know, particularly Ryan, it really stayed with Ryan, had a real impact on him. And Ryan's mother overheard this and came over and said, yeah, as a matter of fact, when he got all of his things back from with his body, we actually went through his wallet, and what did they find? Well, of course, they found the list of all of his strengths from grade 7. Well, what if the teacher had asked him to write down weaknesses and improvement suggestions? My guess is that wouldn't have been in his wallet 10 years later. Might have been in the back of his head somewhere, might have undermined his confidence in some ways, but it wouldn't have been a list he carried in his wallet. And yet in performance appraisals, that's a huge amount, or just performance improvement generally, we tend to focus on weaknesses or closing gaps or training needs. And it tends to take us down a less effective path. And so we're on a bit of a campaign here, and a number of our clients, like a few I'm going to show you here momentarily, who have been down this road now for a few years, are saying it's time to end this focus on weaknesses and to look for strengths. So at Yale University, for example, we have a couple of other universities in Canada, Wilfrid Laurier in Queens and a few others that are started down or looking at following the lead of Yale into a strength-based approach. Here, Michael Peel is talking about how the path to greatness really is by building strengths, not by focusing on weaknesses. Now, there is an exception to that. There is a time when we do need to focus on weaknesses. So I don't want to make you think that we just sort of whistle past the graveyard and pretend that weaknesses aren't there if there's a big problem. We call it a fatal flaw, which sounds really harsh, that term. But what we mean by that is it's fatal to your coaching skill or your coaching effectiveness or your leadership effectiveness. It's a flaw that people can't see past and are not able to see your strengths because of that flaw. And so when something really sticks out, it can have a huge impact on overall leadership or coaching effectiveness, to the point where when there's a fatal flaw and no profound strengths, and a profound strength means at the 90th percentile, then we see that this leader, this coach, is rated very, very poorly overall, and going back to those earlier charts, would be getting very poor outcomes. So it's about focusing on strengths and using the research and using the tools and approaches to move those strengths higher. And the good news is you don't have to be a superhero to be an extraordinary coach or leader, to be rated at the 90th percentile in overall effectiveness. It doesn't mean that you're good at all 14 of those competencies, or in the case of the extraordinary leader, at all 16 of the competencies there. What it means is that if you're good at just a couple, it has a huge impact. So this chart is showing if I have no fatal flaws and no great strengths. I have strengths, but they're not profound. They're not rated at the 90th percentile. So out of all those 14 competencies, nothing stands out. Then I'm going to be down around the 34th percentile. So out of 10 leaders or coaches, I'll be in about 7th place or so. If I have any one of those 14, take it up to the 90th percentile, look at the difference. Now our data shows that we call it the halo effect, that it draws with it higher perceptions of your overall effectiveness as a leader and as a coach. If we have 2, it goes up even higher. 3 takes us up into the top 20% of leaders, and 4 and 5 are now in the top 10% of leaders with 5 profound strengths. Still means that we're not perfect, we're not well-rounded across everything. We're good at up to 5. So 3 to 5 profound strengths has a dramatic impact on perception. And this has a lot of implications when you start thinking about, so what does that mean for our leadership approaches? And of course what it means is we need to spend a whole lot less time on weaknesses, unless there is a fatal flaw, and a whole lot more time leveraging strengths. Here's some of our research showing the impact of weakness versus a strength-based approach. This is where we've run the 360, and then maybe 18, 24 months later, and in the case of General Mills and a couple of long-term clients, they've done this 2, 3, or 4 times over an 8 or 10-year period and have a lot of data to compare back to. So this is where individuals decided, even though they might have been counseled and coached to focus on strengths, decided to focus on their weaknesses. And good news is they improved. So a traditional 360, this would be typically what would happen, that someone getting 360 feedback, and many of you who have experiences with 360s, you see improvement lots of times, such as we see here. But look at this. This is focusing on strengths. So now we see, in this case, double, and in other cases we've seen triple the level of perceived improvement. This is not how the individuals are rating themselves. This is how everybody around them in a subsequent 360 now rates their effectiveness. And so in the second case of strengths, we see a dramatic jump. And so I'll conclude this section then with a quote from another organization that's been down this road with us now for about 5, 6 years. They're in the vascular access business, device business, and healthcare. And here's what Mary has to say on how this approach changed their thinking about performance management, that focusing on strengths really shifted those conversations. And she goes on to talk about that the energy now that people have for those conversations is something that many people now look forward to And she asks, I think, the important question, how many companies can say that performance appraisals are something both the giver and the receiver really look forward to? Well, it is a very different situation when you're building strengths. All right, well, let's leave that iceberg, and let's jump over then to a quick look at what a strengths-based, what are some key elements of a strengths-based 360? Now, again, we can send you a lot more information on this. There's a white paper that talks about these points that I'm going to go through in more depth. I'll just give you a broad overview. First of all, I'll start with why are 360s so popular? Because they are being used now by a large number of organizations. In fact, what we see is that almost 90% of Fortune 500 organizations, large organizations, are using 360s of some sort, and it really can have a major impact. And part of the reason is because, of course, I can assess my own strengths, and things like the VIA, Values and Action Strength Finder in the Positive Psychology Movement, or Gallup's Strength Finder tool, those can all help me assess my own strengths, do a self-assessment, and that's useful. But here's what we find is that when you correlate self-assessment to the outcomes we looked at earlier, engagement levels, and all those other outcomes, that self is the least accurate predictor of those outcomes. That other, the category called peers, direct reports, and finally manager, have much higher. And basically, overall, self is half as accurate as getting input from others. So a lot of people know that, a lot of people realize that, and it's one of the reasons why 360s have become so popular. But the big problem, when we run into time and again, I can probably name half a dozen organizations that we've come across in the last couple of years where they have outright banned 360s, or some key executives, I'm coaching one right now who's using this approach, had the CEO come to him and say he wanted to have him do a 360 and go through coaching, and he refused. He said, I just absolutely will not do that. I've got too many scars from past 360s because it's a painful process. And as we've just seen, it really loses 70 to 80% of the training value. So unless we're building a fatal flaw or fixing a fatal flaw, we're not building strengths. And as a result, and that number, 70, 80%, says that in about 20 to sometimes as high as 30% of the time, fixing a fatal flaw is what has to be done. But in the vast majority of time, we're not doing that. We're building strengths. So the main person behind this approach is Joe Falkman, and he has steeped his entire career, basically, is in psychoassessments. He's a psychometrician. He's created and worked in 360 field. That's where he did his PhD dissertation years ago. And for years, decades, he was doing more traditional 360s. And then when he joined up with Jack Zinger in 2002, he totally started over using a strengths-based approach. So what is a strengths-based approach? Well, here's a quick summary of a few of the main components. First of all, are they based on competencies that matter? We see a lot of competency models that really aren't focused on things that matter that much, don't have a great impact on outcomes. So are we focusing on the right things? Are we comparing to global extraordinary norms, not just averages? Because sometimes it's amazing. People will get a survey, a traditional 360, and look at it and say, oh, well, I'm a bit above average in a lot of this stuff. Hey, I'm doing okay. What we will do is we'll talk about comparing to the 75th percentile and the 90th percentile. And so trying to stretch and help people see what extraordinary looks like. We have a scale here that avoids false positives. And I'm going to explain this one just in a little bit more depth. This is where we've got, here's an example, listen carefully, attentively. Here's a typical 5-point Likert scale, and you have a lot of banding around 4. You end up getting a lot of responses back that in around 4, 4.2, that sort of area. So this person goes away saying, hey, I'm doing okay. I'm a 4 out of 5, kind of above average. Whereas our scale looks like this. The strength-based scale, 3 is competent, 4 is a strength, 5 is outstanding. So 4 is the 75th, 5 is the 90th percentile. So now I'm going to look at that person and say, oh, well, they're okay. They're a 3. Well, that gives a different and a broader range. So the scale helps to separate more clearly the data of the doing okay from the strength from the outstanding strengths. We more clearly see where the differences really lie. So we're going to look at measure against key performance outcomes. We've worked with some clients to help them do that, tailor it for themselves. I've talked about building on strengths, and this whole 360 is looking for those strengths to build on, unless there is a fatal flaw. Here's another key part. How do we tailor a competency model? Well, in our opinion, the best way to tailor a competency model is to tailor it to the individual, not just to executive level, middle management level, supervisory level. What are the competencies that really matter for this person in this job? And so we have all raters who help the individual identify what is the most important set of competencies for their role. The written comments section does not ask it does ask what are this person's greatest strengths, but the follow-up question is not now what are this person's weaknesses. The follow-up question is there a fatal flaw? So that's all we want to know. If there's not, sure, there's weaknesses. We're going to focus on building strengths. It's a short survey. It's only 50-some questions, 54 questions or so, pretty easy to complete, and the feedback reports are pretty simple and straightforward as well. So as I said, we can give you further information. We have a white paper that gets deeper into those components and more of the research behind all of that. Well, our last iceberg that we're going to go across here very quickly is looking at cross-training and the impact of cross-training to build strengths. So it starts with, we call this our CPO grid or CPO model. So the competence or strengths, so identifying which ones are my strongest skill areas. What's this organizational need for my role or position? I just mentioned that's some of the questions we ask for everybody to be able to tailor the competency model to themselves. And then what is it that I'm passionate about? What sustains me for development, for improvement? That becomes a key part of this whole mix, because that's our research shows 6 months, a year from now, what's going to determine if somebody's carrying on with it or not. So we call that the sweet spot. And so by identifying the sweet spot, we can then look to build strengths for each individual and help them build a personal development plan that is tailored to that combination. So once they've arrived and said, okay, this is what I want to work on, how do I figure out how to build around the strength? Well, from the world of athletics, we know that a long-distance runner doesn't just go out and run more once he or she gets to a certain level of effectiveness. They start to do other things like cross-training, which might be weights or mental kinds of things, or nutrition or sleep. Well, this is pretty common approach in high-level athletics. So we bring that same thinking to some of this kind of research where, for example, if you look at the relationship between builds relationships and drives for results. Now, many times managers will look at that and say, well, which one do you want? It's either or. Well, you'll see the power of this combination. But if this is a strength, builds relationships, so it's at the 75th, but this drives to results is maybe around the 50th. It's not a fatal flaw, but it isn't great. It's okay. So the chances that this person will be in the top 10% of leaders, 12%. If, however, we see the opposite combination, build relationships is okay, drives to results is at the 75th, doesn't change much. Still seeing just 14%. Well, if you add the two together, you'd say, well, if they're good at, if it's a 75th percentile at both of these, then math would tell us 26% chance they're going to be in the top 10% of leaders. Well, this powerful combination has shown us whenever this shows up in our database, somebody has this profile, actually over 70% of the time, they're in the top 10% of leaders. So we know there's a relationship here. There's a correlation between these two. And so what Zenger-Folkman has done through their research is identified how do you take something from the 75th to the 90th percentile. So we take an example here of high honesty and integrity. Somebody gets feedback and they see that they're around the 75th. So what do I do to go to the 90th? Do I always be honest, never lie, be really, really honest? Or how do I get to the 90th percentile? Well, our research shows that people who are already at the 90th percentile, what is it that correlates and that we can assume then and know because of the significance, the statistical significance, the correlation, that these are also present. So assertiveness, do I speak up? Do I put my point of view forward? Do I make decisions? So we go see all around now. This becomes a map that I can use. If I've decided I'm going to work on this competency, I can look at this and I can start to decide, well, which couple of these areas do I want to leverage to drive up perceptions of my honesty and integrity, because the word here is displays high honesty and integrity. It's not about my character and am I an honest person. It's about what comes across to others. So here's an example in one of the coaching competencies. So inspiring others to change. And so we start to see the pieces that go into that and start to use that as a model, as a framework to build from. Well, I have covered quite a bit of territory here in our last 50 minutes or so. And so as we draw this to a close, let me talk about, so what can you do from here? Where can you go from here? What are some next steps? Well, we are, for those of you in the Greater Toronto area, or if you have teammates or other parts of your organization that are in the Toronto area that might be interested in attending on the morning of April the 9th, Brad and I are delivering a webinar or a briefing where we're just going to basically go much deeper into what I've covered here in this last almost hour. And then we also are running an extraordinary leader workshop in the Toronto area, in Mississauga, near the airport, and in Calgary. And we're running either the one-day extraordinary coach or the two-day version of the extraordinary coach. And so basically you could go through one and one, so the extraordinary leader, extraordinary coach is a combination that makes sense, or the two-day extraordinary coach, because there's a 360 in the extraordinary coach 2-day and there's a 360 in the extraordinary leader. And it's highly doubtful you'd want to do both and go through 3 days of this, because you'd start to see a fair bit of overlap. So here are the dates. May the 5th is the extraordinary leader in Mississauga, and then the 25th is the first day using the fuel model primarily of the extraordinary coach, and then the 26th is where we get into elevating feedback and do the 360 based around the coaching competencies. The same pattern applies here in Calgary, except it's a little more back-to-back, where June 3rd and 4th is extraordinary leader and extraordinary coach, and then the 5th is the elevating feedback and the 360 around coaching. So for the briefing, again, it's similar to this webinar. It's intended to be focused primarily on people who are concerned about developing leadership skills throughout their organization. And to come back and help you refresh and kind of review then these workshop options. So the one-day extraordinary leader, before the workshop, a 360, you do a 360, or your participants would do a 360. Typically, we say 3 to 4 weeks before the workshop, and get all of that feedback in. And then at the workshop, especially when you get into steps 4 and 5, is where we give you the feedback, and we start working through steps 6, 7, 8, and 9 or 8 into using that feedback and building the personal development plan. For the extraordinary coach, if you're doing just the one day, you can attend just the extraordinary coach, and there are the 2 dates, and use just the fuel model and get into building skills using that framework. Or you can do the 2-day version, which then gives you elevating feedback and the 360. And so basically, your combinations are just the extraordinary leader, just the extraordinary coach, extraordinary leader and the extraordinary coach, or the 2-day extraordinary coach. So there's really 4 potential sorts of combinations there, which you'll find on our website, and you'll find lots more detail on all of this on our website. Well, as we're going to be sending out an email to you, to everyone who's registered, and I know a number of places it's a site that's registered, one person who's registered for a number of people. We'll be sending an email to you, and if you complete that survey, we'll do a draw for 2 draws, basically. We'll draw twice, one for a copy of How to Be Exceptional, which is all about strength building and primarily around the extraordinary leader methodology, and then the second is around the extraordinary coach, which of course is what we've covered here in a fair bit of depth today. We'll also send you links to further articles, white papers, different blogs, a lot of different material that's available on our website. It's a pretty big website. There's a lot of stuff there. We're just going to point out a few links and give you a few links to help you that would build on basically what you've seen here. And as well, this webcast will be archived, and so we'll send you the link for that. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end. I see the clock on the wall tells me it's time to wrap up. And so I'm going to wrap up with one last comment here around strength and building strength, coming back once again to this great pioneer thinker, Peter Drucker, and that chapter on building strength that I mentioned out of his book, The Effective Executive. He talks about how effective executives make strengths productive. We can't really build on weaknesses. Strengths are the true opportunities. They're the ones that can help make weaknesses irrelevant. And there's a lot of psychological research on that, the halo effect, and how strengths can overshadow, towering strengths can overshadow weaker areas unless there's a fatal flaw. That's always the caveat. And so he concludes by saying that we need to feed the opportunities, feed the strengths, and starve the problems by focusing on those strengths. So thank you very much for joining us, and may the force of strength be with you.